One of the privileges of having a podcast is that it enables me to shine a light on examples of everyday heroism that I see in my own life. And in this case, the subject of this conversation is Vanessa Stelling, who has written a book called Julian and I, A Mother's Journey Through Regressive Autism. The way autism has been described to me is that when you're expecting to give birth, it's like you're expecting to go on a holiday in Italy with beautiful sunshine and beautiful buildings and Renaissance and all of that. But then if you discover that your child has autism, it's a bit more like you landed in the Netherlands, cloudy and rainy, lots of water, and a very, very different environment. And what I have seen unfold in Vanessa is just some of the extraordinary heroism and bravery that comes from having to go through being a parent of an autistic child, but the extraordinary courage that I admire and I look up to. And whenever I look at difficult situations that I face, I sometimes think of the journey that she's had and realize how easy I've got it. And in this case, I also wanted to share with you how lucky I am to have as a co-host for this podcast Georgina Godwin, because there is no way that I would have been able to interview and talk to Vanessa with the same sensitivity and draw out the book's qualities and Vanessa's qualities without the skills that Georgina has. It's a lot of fun to do what I would call an amateur version of interviewing people, and it's a real privilege when a professional does it the way Georgina does with Vanessa. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much to Guy, and thank you to him too for putting me onto this extraordinary book. It is compelling, it's moving, it's funny. It encourages the reader to take a completely different view from the accepted narrative about children who are perceived to have a disability. Vanessa, thanks so much for agreeing to talk to me about this incredibly important subject. And I just want to begin by laying out what is regressive autism.
Regressive autism is when the child has acquired certain capacities and abilities, and then they regress at about 2 or 3 years. And it normally begins when they're about 2 years old and they lose speech, or that they lose the ability to move properly. That's how I would phrase it in a nutshell.
Well, take us back then to 9/11. Now, of course, that is the date that the world remembers for the terrible event that took place. But you had some very happy news that day.
Yes, that was the day I found out I was pregnant. That morning, 9/11, I woke up and we had no idea how the day would unfold. And that morning I woke up and I felt really nauseous, and my husband told me I should just sleep in, and he took care of our older son, Max. And then I was feeling so sick, and I got up and I went to the bathroom and I thought, well, maybe I'm pregnant. Maybe that's why I'm feeling so sick. And, looking back, maybe I was feeling sick because there was probably something in the air. And then I did a home pregnancy test and found out I was pregnant with Julian, who is the main character of my book.
How and when did you realize that Julian was different from other children? Because, of course, that pregnancy became instantly traumatic. The World Trade Towers were flattened, and the next few months in New York were appalling. So the pregnancy itself can't have been easy. How was the birth, and did you know at that time that Julian was different?
Well, during the pregnancy, I was really struggling because, to be honest, I've always been and knock on wood, I still am I have a great immune system. But during my pregnancy with Julian, it somehow just collapsed. And I had never had that experience before. And, I was never able to explain how that could have occurred. that I was so sick during a pregnancy, and I had never been sick otherwise in my entire life. So who knows whether it was immune systems that were incompatible, or whether it was due to the lingering effects of a vaccine that I had had. I got the MMR vaccine because it was required for my green card, and I had a very strong reaction to it. And the thing is, I had never been vaccinated as a child. So it was really the first time the second time I'd gotten the vaccine. It was also required when I initially started my master's degree at NYU. It was also required. And then by the time I had to get my green card, it was required again. So to be honest, I don't know why I was so sick during my pregnancy, but I was, and it certainly had an effect on Julian and Julian's development.
And when did you realize that it had affected him?
So I was lucky. I always had another child that I could compare Julian to, because Julian was 3 years younger than Max. So I was always able to compare Julian's development to Max's. And I have to say that Julian's development was very different from Max's. And by the time Julian was a year old, I thought, my goodness, he hasn't reached this milestone, he hasn't reached that milestone. So I knew, I would say, like when Max was sitting up and, very coordinated and very alert and awake, by 8 months, I noticed that Julian was certainly lagging behind. So I would say around 6 to 8 months.
And you started seeing doctors. I mean, you were concerned and you wanted to know what was wrong with your child, but there didn't seem to be any answers.
Yes, and it was, all the information was extremely, my goodness, it was so vague at the time. I remember Julian's head growing at an exponential rate. I remember he had a really big head compared to his body. And at that time, just when it was just during that time in his development that an article appeared in the New York Times about head circumference and the prevalence of autism in relation to the size of the head circumference. And there was a direct correlation. And then I became concerned, and I realized that I wouldn't get the answers from the pediatricians. I would have to turn to the media and to, the internet for more information.
And at this time, you also started considering environmental factors because, of course, New York was hugely polluted after 9/11.
Incredible, yes. I did not know about the asbestos in the buildings, for example. I assumed that was the reason why there was a white dust on our windowsills that I wrote about in my book. And then I also write about the West Nile disease that Rudolph Giuliani tried to combat with spraying. He was spraying the city with an insecticide, which we weren't even really informed about, or the media covered it, but in a very limited manner. So, I mean, those are just two examples of things that were in the air, but I don't know what else might have been.
You did eventually get a diagnosis of developmental delay and eventually autism.
Exactly. So I moved to London. After London, we moved to Switzerland because by the time when we were living in London, we realized that it was probably in Julian's best interest to move to Switzerland because the air quality and just the reduced amount of toxic environmental influences would be beneficial to Julian's health. And so that was when Julian was 3 years old, when he was finally diagnosed by a Swiss pediatrician. And the diagnosis was pervasive developmental delay, not otherwise specified, PDD-NOS. Now, this diagnosis fell under the rubric of autism spectrum disorder. And this diagnosis was made when Julian was 3 years old, and it was made by a pediatrician in Switzerland who was familiar with the new terms that were basically American, because in Switzerland, autism had not been officially recognized as a developmental disorder yet. It was still seen as a psychiatric disorder. This would have been 2005. So this doctor was cutting edge, I would say. he was well versed with what was happening in the States, and he realized that there were kids who were developing autism at a very early age.
And so at this point, you decided to take action. I mean, you were already researching everything you could do on the internet. You were looking at the media. You were trying alternative therapies and complementary medicine. But then you introduced something called ABA. What's that?
So applied behavior analysis was a method that was developed by Lovas, and he was in California in the 70s. He developed a method of intensive behavioral intervention. And basically, it modified the behavior of people who exhibited very challenging behavior. And this was done through a method of reward. So when a person exhibited the preferred behavior, the person was rewarded. And this is what we put in place for Julian. So we introduced applied behavior analysis into our home. We introduced this method into our home because we realized it would be an all-encompassing program. It would require the whole home because that was Julian's learning environment. And so we had the behavior analyst who had been trained in ABA. And then we had several therapists who helped us execute the therapy, and they had to be trained in ABA. They were psychology students from the local universities. They were young girls, and they came and they worked with Julian. The objective, in order to make this plan successful, was to work with Julian 40 hours a week. And they came into our home, and we basically had to structure our entire environment, our entire home around his program.
ABA was one way of addressing challenging behaviour, but through a system of rewards. But I'm interested in how that challenging behaviour manifested itself. For instance, Julian absolutely loves trains and buses, and it was incredibly difficult to keep him in the house. He kept running away, and that must have been so hard to deal with. Tell us about that.
Yes, exactly. He was obsessed with buses and trains, and I hadn't I had no idea exactly what this obsession encompassed because with a normal child like Max, I mean, he would never have thought of, if he had been interested in God knows what, in a train, he wouldn't have chased a train. But with Julian, he knew where the bus stop was down the road, and he jumped on his scooter and disappeared. And then if the bus happened to drive by, he would chase the bus down the road. And we were living at Lake Zurich, and I don't know if you know Zurich, but so the bus was going continually downhill at a really nice pace. So he didn't really have to make much of an effort to keep up with the bus. It was just sort of going downhill, and he was pursuing that bus and able to chase it. And that was what we were dealing with, Julian chasing the bus.
But I mean, often he would disappear. I mean, there are so many heartbreaking scenes in the book where you're sobbing on the phone to the police who find him. And it has to be said, people exhibit tremendous kindness to this boy who is non-verbal.
Yes.
But then you also get a lot of judgment too. So for instance, there's one scene that you describe in a supermarket.
Yes, exactly. At the supermarket, I would just have to take him with me sometimes to run errands. And I would go to the supermarket, and he just started taking things off the shelves, just one thing after the other. And then some person came up to me and said, this is just absolutely irresponsible behavior. And and there were also other scenes at the supermarket, not ones that I mentioned in my book, but other scenes where he would have a meltdown by the time that we got to pay for everything. And he's just lying on the ground screaming because he can't handle the lights and the commotion. Oh, wait, but there was another scene in the book that I mentioned where he's just running through the aisles, exactly, screaming because it's just too much stimulation. So challenges are nonstop. As soon as you leave the front door, there are challenges.
And of course, by now you have another child. So you have three children. You have Julian, you also have Max and Aurelia, and your marriage has disintegrated. So basically, you're dealing with all of this. You have the help of professionals, but they're in your home all of the time. This is not easy at all. Then something wonderful happens. You referred to Julian just not being able to deal with all the sensory demands on him, and you suddenly start seeing the world the way that Julian sees it. And that really opens the door for you.
Yes, it was a huge time in my life where I suddenly began to see things from Julian's perspective, because things weren't changing. I couldn't change things the way that they were. And to come to this realization, because you can have someone who's really stubborn and obstinate and driven and so determined to make everything work for their child. And then you get to a point and you realize that maybe the child doesn't want to change. And this is the point that I got to. And it was, but then you really hit a wall, because you realize, okay, now I'm really up against a very strong power here. Because you think your love is stronger than anything in the world. And you realize that no, there's actually something stronger. And that's the free will of your own child. So that's what I came up against. And I realized that I just had to accept Julian the way he was.
But that's so much easier said than done, particularly, as I say, when you have all these other demands on your time. Your son Max at this point, turns out he has been struggling with ADHD, and you have this little girl. Now they both adore Julian, but his behavior, as we say, was challenging. A sort of OCD, a lot of repetitive knocking on doors or switching on and off light switches, that kind of thing. And I just wonder how your acceptance helped you deal with that behavior, which must have been affecting all of the family.
Yes. Well, it taught me, it did teach me not to take everything so seriously, because you really become demented if you're with a kid who has severe autism all day. If you're dealing with that all day long, you go crazy. He would basically just come into a room, and then he would see the box of switches on the wall, the light switches, and then he would just press buttons, and the lights would go on and off, on and off, on and off. And then the fuse would blow, and I couldn't get him away from the light switch, or he would go to the door handle and yank it, and I couldn't let him out of the house because he would run away. So I would let him yank the door handle. If the door handle didn't have a lock and key, he would just slam the door against the wall until the hinges would loosen and the whole door frame would loosen and the door would fall out of the wall. So it was incredibly challenging and hard on the children. It was on the other two children. It was really hard on them. Max, my oldest, would basically go into his room and focus on doing his homework. I would focus on taking care of Julian, and Aurelia my youngest, would sort of creep into a corner somewhere and keep herself busy. But it basically frayed a family. It tears a family apart. It's so damaging to a healthy family.
And of course, damaging to other relationships too. You focus in one chapter about your friends, and you talk about having a much needed night out, a glass of wine with a friend. But of course, people always talk about their children, and she was comparing her children to yours and talking about their developmental milestones, and just not understanding that Julian needed to be judged by completely different standards, and that what she was talking about just did not resonate with you. Made you quite angry.
It did make me quite angry. And it's interesting you should ask this question or you make this remark, because it still happens all the time. And I wonder what it is. I think it's just a lack of exposure to people who are different and people who have developmental disabilities, and especially to other parents who have children with developmental disabilities, because it still happens all the time. I have to say that people come up to me and they brag about their children, and I think, my goodness, really has your perspective not shifted a little bit? But no, I guess it hasn't.
But I mean, that's the wonderful thing about this book, is that people who read it, well, certainly for me, I suddenly understood what you were saying, and that you cannot judge all people in the same way, and that Julian gets joy out of living, and that Julian gives joy too.
Oh my goodness, he gives so much joy. I mean, he's so popular. He's in his home now, and everyone knows his name. I walk around the grounds with him, and people say, "Hi, Julian," and they all know him, and he laughs and responds, and he's still nonverbal. He doesn't speak, but there's always a response. There's always a demonstration of appreciation. He's doing extremely well.
But getting to that point where he could be in residential care, and indeed even in education, was enormously difficult.
It was extremely difficult. And I think it might be easier for people now, just because autism is, for parents now, because autism is really recognized as a developmental disorder. And there's no longer this misconception that maybe it's a developmental disorder or just a global developmental delay that the kids might grow out of. No, it's a pervasive developmental disorder. Yeah, so it's been really hard to recognize just how pervasive Julian's problem was, and how, that's why I put regressive autism. That's why I use that word to describe his autism and to define it, because there was nothing to prepare me for the scope of his developmental problem. And the term that best sums it up is regressive, because no one took me seriously. And regressive is really the best word to say, this is serious. This is, I suppose, in a way like Alzheimer's. You're regressing. There is no progress. There is progress certainly in the emotional landscape. He grew emotionally during all this time, but when it comes to his development in terms of speech and his coordination, his cognitive abilities, no, there was no progress. And there was a lot of regression.
You really issue, I suppose, a call to action. You talk about the need for a new paradigm in special education. So I just want to quote you a little bit from the book. You write, "Like yin and yang, teaching and learning create a dynamic symbiosis. One defines the other and they cannot exist independently. So what happens when an autistic child does not perform according to recognized standards of progress and development? What occurs when a child cannot be socialized and integrated because the system won't yield to them? Doesn't it call for the emergence of an entirely new paradigm of education?" And that's where you discovered the work of Phoebe Caldwell.
Yeah, Phoebe Caldwell is an amazing person. She's written incredible books. It's really helpful. And basically, I apply her method all the time, because I live just down the road from Julian, and I live just down the road from the center where he resides now. And I come across his old classmates and his old housemates. So they recognize me, we say hi. And then they start to engage in their tics, whatever it might be. And the key is to respond to these tics. And then you start a communication. So it's not just enough to say, "Oh, hi," whatever their name, "Hi, Giuseppe," and to pat them on their shoulder. But you have to actually respond to what they do. And they have many different modes of communication, but we say that children with autism or people with autism don't communicate, but they do. They just don't use language the way we do. And so they can't respond. If we speak to them, they cannot respond with speech. So it is our responsibility to respond with their gestures. So whatever they might do, if they're like clicking their fingers, or if they're tapping their heads, and then you just copy them. And if you do that, you acknowledge their communication And that's enough for them to feel like they're being heard. It is the simplest thing to do, and you see it immediately. There's an immediate response, and it is so beautiful.
Vanessa, you talk about dreaming of Julian and in a way almost becoming him in your sleep.
Yes, my goodness, I've dreamt of Julian so often, and I know a lot of other mothers do too, that they dream of because I belong to a Facebook groups for parents of children with autism, and they often speak about things like this, and it's very encouraging to dream of Julian when he speaks to me, when I'm dreaming, and then he'll speak to me. And there was the most profound dream I had was when he was 10 years old. And I basically became him. I experienced, we meshed, we became one. And I experienced his vision of the family home. And I just saw life through his eyes. And he was in our kitchen, actually in my parents' house. And I just felt this incredible urgency that life is speeding up. There's so many things that are occurring in this world, and there's so many messages to be relayed. And my goodness, there are more important things to focus on. And then he's looking at this kitchen scene, and there's me, just me as his mom, standing behind the sink, probably loading the dishwasher, because that's what I spent most of my time doing. And then my mother there, and I guess Max and Aurelia moving about too, and whoever else was there. And everyone was moving around like they had clay on their feet, like they were glue on their feet, just in slow motion, and not happy either. Like everyone was talking about, what they had to do and their responsibilities and everything that was weighing them down. And then I realized from Julian's perspective that life is so much lighter and brighter, and that we have this we have this beautiful world to enjoy and take advantage of. And it was, that all that information was relayed so clearly to me in that dream that I write about.
You talk about embracing diversity and how brave and brilliant our children are to bring more diversity into our world with their inappropriate ways that yank everyone out of their comfort zone. And then you go on to say that most of us spend our lifetime doing the opposite by conforming. We follow convention, we seek approval, and then we wonder why we feel a void and didn't follow our heart. And that's really what that dream sums up, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And, he still is that way. Like I recently heard a YouTube video by someone I follow on YouTube. And he's great. He's a spiritual teacher. And he said that he's been getting a lot of people reaching out to him, asking him whether this isn't a time just to be silent, because there's such an influx of information coming upon us. There is so much information that we have to deal with at the moment. And to come to terms with everything is so overwhelming. And then you feel like you have to respond as well. Like there has to be a response. And there's an incredible desire among a lot of people, I think, just to be silent and to not always have to give one's opinion, and just to be perhaps nonverbal, I would say. I mean, I'm putting that word in, I'll say maybe they just have a desire to be nonverbal. That's what Julian is teaching us, that this is really a time where maybe it's just time to be silent and just to be. I mean, we can still laugh. We can certainly still express our happiness and our capacity to be jubilant, but maybe it's just a time to be silent. And that's what Julian teaches me.
You end the book by saying, I'd always imagined Julian to be vulnerable because he requires constant care and protection. This is, of course, true, but I cannot limit myself to only seeing my son as a physical being. As a soul, he couldn't be more independent and expansive. He has, after all, taught me that we only become vulnerable when we allow our happiness and our sense of fulfillment to depend on the behaviour and actions of others. And if we remain completely true to ourselves, there is never a problem in the long run. The saying that real happiness comes from within couldn't ring any truer. Vanessa, are you and Julian happy?
Yes, and happiness should not be conditional upon outside influences. But I have to admit that my happiness is still conditional upon how well Julian is doing. so I'll say that I am happy because Julian is well, and my 2 other children are doing really well too. So I'm happy. Julian's doing really well because he has such a wonderful influence on his environment, and he's found the perfect environment to be himself in. So yes, it's all good.
Vanessa, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Georgina.
Julian and I, A Mother's Journey Through Regressive Autism by Vanessa Stelling is out now.